He did the wrong thing first. That's the part nobody talks about. Declan Marsh, 22, had been sleeping outside for 11 days when he made the information make. He took the tent. It was a good one, too. A 2-person dome tent, olive green, dropped off by a church group on a Tuesday afternoon in November. Portland, Oregon. The camp was under the Morrison Bridge, and the wind that comes off the Willamette Inn. November doesn't care what brand your gear is. He set it up facing east, which felt right. He'd watched a YouTube video about wind direction once. He staked the corners the way the diagram in the stuffed sack showed. He slept in it that first night and thought, okay, this is manageable. This is something he could handle. The tent lasted 9 days, not because it tore exactly, not because it was cheap. It lasted 9 days before the floor seams started pulling apart at the corners, before the rain. Fly developed a slow leak along the ridgepole, before the whole structure started to list every time the wind picked up, which in November, under a bridge, in Portland, is basically constant. He kept staking it back down. He kept waking up at 2 a.m. with his sleeping bag wet at the foot end. On the 9th night, a guy named Gus, who'd been camping about 40 feet away, came over and watched Declan fight with the tent in the rain for a minute. 2. Gus had been out there for close to 3 years. He wasn't the kind of person who lectures people. He just watched, and then he said, "That thing's going to fail on you." Declan said he knew. Gus said, "The ones they donate are always the same. They're not built for this." Then he walked back to his own spot, where Gus had something that didn't look like anything in particular, a low structure against the concrete bridge support, made of garbage bags and bungee cords and what appeared to be 2 pieces of PVC pipe. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't tall enough to stand up inside. From a distance, it looked like someone had left a pile of trash against the wall, but it was dry. Declan noticed that specifically because he was not dry, and Gus was. And Gus had been every single night since Declan had arrived at the camp. Here's what Declan knew about garbage bags before any of this. Nothing useful. He knew they held trash. He knew the thick ones were better than the thin ones. He knew that the big orange Contractor bags were different from the kitchen bags. Under the sink. That was it. What he had no reason to know was that a 42-gallon Contractor bag, when sealed, traps an air pocket that insulates, that 2 layers of them, one inside the other with an inch of air between, do something that a single layer of standard tent fabric doesn't. That the same material designed to be waterproof for garbage is by that exact property waterproof for a person sleeping inside a structure made of it. He learned all of this from watching Gus. Not from asking Gus. He asked once, early on, how the garbage bag thing worked. And Gus sort of shrugged and said he'd figured it out over time. That wasn't a closed door, just the way Gus talked. So Declan watched instead. What he saw over the next 2 weeks, while he kept patching his tent and Gus kept being dry, was this. Gus's shelter had a frame. 2 lengths of half-inch PVC pipe crossed at the top and anchored at the base with concrete blocks he'd pulled from nearby. The whole thing was about 4 feet tall at the peak and 6 feet long. Over that frame, Gus had stretched a series of Contractor bags that had been slit open and taped. Together, not with duct tape, which Gus had tried and rejected, but with Gorilla. Tape, the black kind, which bonds differently and holds in cold and wet where duct tape eventually separates. The bags weren't just draped over. They were layered. The outer layer ran lengthwise. The inner layer ran across. Where they met, they created something. Like a double wall with an air gap. The inside of the structure stayed, if not warm exactly, at least not wet. The difference between not wet and wet, when you're sleeping outside, in November, is the difference between waking up functional and waking up in a medical situation. That's not an exaggeration. That's just what 37 degrees and damp does to a person overnight. Gus's shelter had been in that spot for 7 months when Declan arrived. He'd rebuilt it twice, both times by choice, not because it failed. The second rebuild was because he'd worked out a better way to anchor the ground layer. He'd also added a door, not a zipper, just a flap of two overlapping bag sections that you pushed aside to enter, and that fell closed from their own weight. The church group that came back each month kept offering Declan replacement tents. He kept saying yes and then using each one the same way he'd used the first one, and watching it fail the same way. It wasn't a bad tent, it just wasn't built for living in day after day, in actual weather. Gus's structure was built for exactly that. The thing Declan couldn't shake at first was how it looked. He'd grown up in Beaverton, 20 minutes outside Portland. His parents had a house with a garage and a lawn. He'd had a bedroom. He'd had a period after. High school, where things went wrong in the way they go wrong for some people. A job that didn't last. A relationship that ended badly. A few months of couch. Surfing that turned into something longer. An eviction notice on a place he'd been staying that wasn't technically in his name. He ended up at the camp under the Morrison Bridge in October, 11 days before the church group brought the tents. He wasn't someone who thought of himself as a person who would sleep in a structure made of garbage bags. That's not a moral statement. It's just the way the brain works. You carry an image of yourself, and certain things don't fit it, and the mismatch feels like a reason not to do the thing even when the thing makes sense. Gus had no patience for that once he understood what was happening. Not mean about it, just direct. He said, "It looks bad. It works. Pick one." Declan picked looking bad. He started talking to Gus about the build in earnest around week 3. By then, his third tent, a newer model the church had sourced, supposedly an upgrade, had developed the same floor seam problem as the first one. It was mid-November. The temperature at night was dropping into the high 30s. Wet cold at that. Temperature isn't a miserable camping situation, it's a dangerous one. Gus walked him through it without making it complicated. The frame first. Half-inch PVC pipe from any hardware store, though Gus had, found his at a construction dumpster. 2 blocks from the camp. 2 pieces each, about 6 feet long. Cross them at the center, zip tie or tape them at the junction. The cross creates a ridge. Drive the ends into the ground or weight them with whatever's heavy. Concrete blocks, filled sandbags, rocks, steeper. Pitch means water runs off faster. Gus had settled on roughly 40 degrees. The bags next. Contractor bags, not kitchen bags. Slit them along one seam and one end to open them flat, then join them edge to edge with Gorilla Tape to make panels. The outer layer covers the frame from ridge to ground on both sides. The inner layer goes inside, attached to the underside of the frame pieces. The air gap between them, even an inch, makes a difference you can feel. The ground layer is where Gus said most people go wrong. It was where Declan went wrong on his first attempt. The bottom edge of the outer wall layer needs to be overlapped by at least 8 inches of ground layer bag. And that overlap needs weight on it. Rocks, blocks, anything that keeps it down. If wind gets under the ground layer, the structure acts like a sail. Declan learned this at 1 a.m. on a night with 25-mile-an-hour gusts, when the shelter he built that afternoon lifted off the ground at one corner and he spent 40 minutes in the rain fixing it. The second build was better. Ground overlap was 12 inches. 4 concrete blocks, hauled from the same dumpster Gus used. He added a second outer layer on the windward side only. That's where the rain came from. 2 layers on the west, 1 on the east. That version lasted through the rest of November, all of December, and into January. By that point, Declan had been outside for 3 months. No tent from the church group had lasted longer than 12 days. What happens to a donated tent in continuous outdoor use isn't a mystery. They're built for weekend camping, 2 nights, maybe 3, then packed and stored in a garage until next summer. The stress points, floor seams, guy wire grommets, Zipper tracks, the attachment points between the rainfly and the pole sleeves, are engineered for that kind of use. Daily stress in actual weather hits those points in sequence. The seams go first, then the zipper binds or corrodes, then the pole sleeves tear. You can patch each. Failure for a while, and most people do. And then you run out of patch and the structure is gone. The garbage bag structure doesn't work the same way. When a bag section fails, and they do fail, usually at a tape seam, you replace that section. A roll of Gorilla Tape runs about $9. A 40-pack of Contractor bags is around $12. Gus's total materials over 3 years came to somewhere under $60. He hadn't kept exact track. He was sure it was under $70. The tent Declan first received retailed for $140. The replacement was $90. The third was about $75. That's over $300 in tents across 11 weeks. None of them were still standing. Gus's $60 structure was on its 8th month. There were people at the camp who thought what Gus had built was embarrassing. That's not a mean interpretation. It's just what some of them said out loud. One guy, older, had a heavy-duty canvas wall tent he'd gotten somewhere and set up with actual aluminum poles. He was openly contemptuous of the garbage bag. Setup. He said it looked like a crime scene. He said it was the kind of thing you see in pictures from disaster zones. He said a person ought to have some self-respect. Gus didn't argue. He'd been outside long enough to know that argument costs energy you need for other things. The canvas tent guy's setup failed in February. A sustained wind event, Portland, got a bad one that year. 3 days of gusts pulled 2 of his pole stakes out of the saturated ground and brought the whole thing down on him at about 4 a.m. He spent the rest of the night in a doorway 2 blocks away. Gus's structure flexed in the same wind. The bag material moved. The tape seams held. He woke up dry. Declan was awake for most of those 3 days. He spent one afternoon at a warming center nearby, but he was in the structure for most of the nights. The windward outer layer rattled. One bag section pulled at a seam and he taped it from the inside. 4 minutes. That was the emergency. He thought about that afterward more than he expected to. The tent he'd been given was designed by people who understood shelter. The garbage bag structure was figured out by one person sleeping outside who needed something to work and had hardware store supplies and time to think. The designed thing failed. Repeatedly, the improvised thing held. That's an uncomfortable thing to actually sit with because it doesn't have a clean explanation. It's not that the tent manufacturers were negligent or that the church group was wrong to donate. It's just that a tool designed for 2 nights a year is a different object from a tool that needs to work every night for months. And when they look similar from the outside, both are called shelters, both keep rain off. It's easy to miss that they're not the same thing. Declan wasn't an engineer or a policy person. He was just someone who'd been cold and then not cold, and he'd noticed the difference and what had caused it. By March, 3 other people at the camp had built versions of the structure. None of them were copies. A guy named Travis had added a shelf inside, a piece of plywood he'd found, that kept his bag and his shoes off the ground. A woman named Kim, 23, who'd been at the camp for about 5 weeks, built hers so it attached directly to a concrete bridge support using the structure as one full wall. That version was probably the most weather-resistant of any of them. The concrete took the wind on that side completely. The other 3 sides only had to deal with what came around the edges. Declan's version had one modification Gus hadn't tried: insulation packed into the gap between the inner and outer bag layers, not batting or foam. Newspaper, dense layered newspaper pressed into the double wall. It doesn't hold up if moisture gets in, so it only works if the outer layer is genuinely watertight, which his was by that point. On nights below freezing, the difference was real. His hands were less stiff in the morning. His sleeping bag stayed drier, because condensation from his breath was hitting the newspaper layer instead of the inner bag surface. He told Gus about it. Gus said he'd thought about newspaper but worried about moisture. Declan said it was only reliable if the outer layer was solid. Gus said that tracked. They weren't really collaborating. It was more like two people who'd been working on the same problem from different angles, comparing what they'd found. Spring came. Declan got housed in April through a city program. He'd been on the wait list since December. The apartment was in southeast Portland, one-room shared bathroom down the hall, $410 a month with a subsidy covering most of it. Before he left the camp, he took his structure apart carefully. He kept the PVC pipes. He kept the Gorilla Tape. He left the bags, the newspaper, the concrete blocks. Kim and Travis were still there. They'd use what they could. He'd been outside for 6 months. 3 of those months in tents that kept failing. 3 in a garbage bag structure that didn't. He still thinks about those 9 days. The 9 days between when his first tent started failing and when he finally talked to Gus about building something else. 9 days spent trying to fix a solution that wasn't working, rather than trying a different one. That's not a dramatic amount of time, but at 37 degrees and wet, 9 nights is a lot of nights. Here's what the garbage bag shelter won't do. It won't hold up if the tape seams aren't maintained. You need to check them after any significant wind. Retape anything that's pulling. It doesn't work at all without a real frame. You can't just drape bags over yourself and expect anything useful to happen. It's not invisible. A structure like this draws attention, which in some locations matters, and in others doesn't. And it's not a permanent fix for anything. It's a way to stay dry and functional while something else is being worked on. What it does do is last. Under real conditions, in real weather, with real daily use, a well-built garbage bag structure outlasts a donated tent. Not because it's better designed in any formal sense, but because when a section fails, you replace the section, and the material is cheap and everywhere and the tape is strong enough to actually hold. Gus was still at the camp when Declan got housed, still under the Morrison Bridge, same spot by the concrete support. His structure was on its 10th month, with 1 full rebuild and a handful of section replacements. He didn't make anything of it. Neither did Declan. Declan asked him on his last day whether he'd ever written any of it down. The method, the measurements, the specific tape. Gus thought about it for a second and said no, said he'd figured it out piece by piece and it was all still in his head. Declan said maybe he should write it down. Gus said maybe. Here's something Gus knew that nobody had told him. The seam is always the failure point. On a tent, on a bag, on anything you put together under repeated stress. You reinforce the seam or you accept that it fails. Everything else is secondary. He'd never read that. He'd just watched seams fail until he understood why. And then he'd stopped using tape that didn't hold and started using tape that did. That's how most of this kind of knowledge actually moves. Not through campaigns or product manuals. Through one person who figured it out talking to another person who needed to know. The problem is that the person who's figured it out is usually the last one anyone thinks to ask. Declan asked. That's the only reason he knows any of this. Here's the question worth actually thinking about. How long have you been trying to fix the thing that isn't working? Not patching it, not managing it, actually fixing it. And is there someone 40 feet away who's been doing something that looks weird and wrong but is, by every practical measure, working better? Because that's exactly what was there. Gus was 40 feet away the whole time.